Welcome to the After School Project. This is an initiative to uplift voices of color. Before we begin, we must acknowledge the land that we are on. On behalf of North Seattle College, we acknowledge that we occupy the traditional ancestral lands of the Coast Salish people, specifically the Duwamish tribe, a people that are still here, continuing to honor and bring to light their ancient heritage. Without them, we would not have access to this gathering, dialogue, and learning space. We ask that we take this opportunity to thank the original caretakers of this land who are still here. This episode is brought to you by North Seattle College.
There we go. All right. Well, welcome, Representative Berg. We're so happy to have you. I'm going to pass it over for an introduction, if you don't mind.
Yeah, thank you so much. It's great to be here. My name is Representative April Berg, and I represent the 44th Legislative District. It's a little bit north of Seattle. That includes the city of Mill Creek, city of Lake Stevens, city of Snohomish, a tiny bit of Everett, and a tiny bit of Marysville. It's great to be a representative of folks in the north end of the Puget Sound. But in addition to that, I'm also a school board director. So I have a passion around education and education policy. Here in our state of Washington, we have a citizen legislature. So you'll notice that just about all of my colleagues have day jobs. And a couple of those day jobs are school board directors. So myself and a senator, we're also school board directors, and a couple of us in the House are also city council members. So it's kind of a diversity there. As far as the legislature goes, I am happy to be serving on 3 committees. I'm the vice chair of the finance committee. And then I'm also in the local governments committee, and then also the education committee, because that being my wheelhouse, it seemed like an appropriate place for me to serve. So just thank you so much for being here, and I'm excited to talk with you.
Well, wonderful. Thank you for that introduction. Maybe I'll start with the first question and then we can just rotate through. So the first question I have for you is, what changes are you seeing across the state in terms of education, and what are you most excited about?
In terms of education, and what are you most excited about?
That is a great question, because it's a great and very timely question. As everyone knows, we're in a public health crisis. And that changed just in dramatic ways education. If you would have told me last February, that in less than 2 weeks, we're going to shut down every K through 12 school, everybody's going to be learning at home, and we're going to be like that for well over a year, I would have said, yeah, no, that's not going to happen. But it did happen. And we did it. In some places it worked out, some places it didn't. It's been a struggle for a lot of parents, it's been a struggle for a lot of students, but we've learned a lot. And the one thing I've learned, and this is where education is going, is that you can't say the word can't. We are now in a moment of moonshots. If we can shut down every K through 12 institution in a matter of weeks and get folks at home learning remotely, then we can do anything. And so what I'm most excited about for education is the changes that we knew were necessary, but they seemed impossible. But now we're at a point where the impossible has become the necessary. And so when you look at some of the differences we've made with early childhood education, the funding and the resources that we're putting towards that, when you look at some of the changes with just K-12 education, giving students alternative pathways to graduation, getting everybody over the finish line. And then when you look at the discussions of equity in education, what that means, not just about teaching equity in our classroom, but teaching our leaders and our teachers to be equitable and understanding what that means. So, honestly, it's unicorns and rainbows for education. We can no longer say this is something we can't do and can't be done. So that's kind of that's where I see it going, and that's what has me excited. I hate that a public health crisis is what got us here, though.
Thank you so much.
Mhm.
I'll ask you the next question. If I want to get involved in policy, what is a good first step?
That is a phenomenal question. So first off, everybody needs to get involved in policy. But the good first step is where you are. And so a little bit about kind of where I am and why I'm here is because of education. I started becoming active in policy discussions because I was thoroughly unhappy with my kids' school experience. And I've got 6 kids. So I've got a 26 and 25-year-old, I've got a 22 and 21-year-old, and I've got a 15 and 16-year-old. And that older set of kids, I was distraught. I thought this can't be it. There has to be more. And being a Black parent, being the mother Black, being told no so many times. He's now 25, but when he was younger, it was far easier to get a football in his hand than a chess piece. And so it took policy changes. It took me advocating, and then it took me being in leadership to make it happen. So where I'm going with it is start where you are, right? So the best way to get involved in policy is when you look around you, you go, this isn't right. This shouldn't be the case. I want to change it. That's where you start. That will lead you down a path to many, many other things. And most times what ends up happening is people telling you, well, it's not your school board that can do that. Okay, well, who can do it? Well, the state can do it. Great, I'm going to go to the state. Well, it's not the state. Maybe it's the feds. Oh, well, let me go talk to the feds. That's how you start getting involved. But the other piece of it is understanding that we don't do this alone. As leaders and legislators, we work with a lot of stakeholder groups. So if you're passionate about something specifically in education policy, maybe it's graduation requirements, maybe it's athletics, maybe it's having more teachers of color in the classroom. Work with those stakeholder groups, those organizations, and take a look at their policy initiatives, their goals, find some commonality, and jump right in. It's the best way to get started.
Thank you.
As we kind of think about the future, what do you think will be the biggest policy issues facing education in the next 5 years?
Yeah, that's a question we're all asking ourselves. Because again, if you would have asked me that exact question 24 months ago, I would have said something very, very different. Right now, I think the biggest policy discussions is how we educate our students. And to put some framework around that, traditionally you have got a teacher in front of the classroom and they're teaching their kiddos, right? And those kids are taking tests and then they're taking high stakes tests at various points in their academic career. What we found through virtual learning is that maybe there's different ways, maybe there's different learning styles. Maybe that kid that we thought wasn't really engaged is really engaged, but they were dealing with a lot of microaggressions in the classroom. So I think over the next 5 years, we're going to have to look at what education really means and what it means for the whole child. And that might be a term that you're using in this coursework, but looking at the whole child is really where we're going with education. So at no point, and I can say this with fairly certainly, that at no point are we going back to the old way of doing things. At no point am I going to ever look at a parent and say, if your kid can't make it to that classroom by 7:30 a.m., I don't know what to tell you. There's no options. There are going to be options. They're going to be virtual. They're going to be learning differentiated. And there's going to be multiple pathways to graduation. And I think the most exciting thing for education right now is competency-based learning and mastery-based learning. Moving away, there's nothing. We are now seeing that because we had to see it, because we had to figure out ways around it. We had to figure out ways to get our seniors graduated. Well, why couldn't we do that for little Johnny and Joni when they were struggling? Why couldn't we see that they were mastering a subject matter in a non-traditional way? So I think in the next 5 years, that's going to be codified. You're going to look at legislators across the nation saying, yep, we got to figure out how we can give these kids credit and get them to college and beyond in a meaningful way without killing their spirit. So that's what I'm excited about. And that's kind of why I wake up in the morning.
Well, I'm gonna probably go off task a little bit. That's just like I like to do sometimes. But I really love hearing about the themes across of like looking at education in a different format and understanding like teachers' bias and how that's introduced to kids and how your son personally was impacted by that being a Black male. And so I think one thing I look at in our class talks about is the accountability piece, what I feel is missing among our stakeholders, right? Of like, yes, we get a bill passed, is great, but then the school district's not really held to the accountability to actually see through that all their teachers actually go through implicit bias training or to follow the rate of where the money is being placed. So how are y'all holding this different places around the state of Washington accountable so that these equitable outcomes are across the state, not just locally in maybe a couple districts?
Yes, I it's so interesting that you asked that. I was on the phone earlier today, slightly frustrated with a group of folks who had implemented, we have a new law and it just got implemented this year and they did it in a way that was not textbook. I'll just leave it there, right? And I was frustrated and really not even frustrated at them, but I was frustrated at the holes and the gaps. And to your point, where's the accountability, right? So how can I keep folks accountable? And that goes back to your question, Natasha, about policy and how to get involved in policy. It's because the job is never done. So what you have to do, it sounds really basic and weird, right? See something, say something. My office does a lot of casework. All of your legislator offices do a lot of casework. If you see something not being done in the right way, you got to speak up. And it's either working with those policy advocates that maybe wrote the law, it's calling or writing your legislator saying, look, this is not working. It's talking to, and I like elected leaders, right? So talking to your school board directors, because those are the folks who, quite frankly, aren't cutting a paycheck, right? They're doing it because they want to do the work. And so if it's not being done, if something isn't being implemented, the leaders want to know about it, right? Because that's why we put these things in place. One example I'll give you, and I was just talking to a group of students the other day, I passed a bill this session on for menstruation equity. So our menstruating youth at schools, K-12 community colleges, and universities will actually have access to free menstruation products in all women's restrooms, all gender neutral restrooms. And if you don't have a gender neutral, you're going to have product men's room. So making it very equitable. Now, can I police every single bathroom out there? No. And I told these young folks, I said, if it's not happening in your space, if you feel like there's a roadblock, reach out to my office, reach out to, we had, 3 or 4 different really powerful stakeholder groups that help move this legislation forward. Reach out to them so that we can help and fix it and overcome it. I wish there was a better way, but it's going to be the same with that equity training. Just passing that bill where our school board directors need to go through equity DEI training. That's going to be great. But I will tell you, there are folks out there doing some really bad DEI training, right? There is. And there's nothing I can do or you can do to force folks to go with the right people to do it. But what you can do is say, look, this didn't work. These folks shouldn't have done it this way. This board is not properly trained. This is a complaint I want to file. You just have to hold people accountable. And I wish it was easier and more straightforward, but you have to just, write the letters, do the emails, protest. I mean, it's crazy to be an elected official, but I've told many people, they're like, I'm going to go protest. I'm like, you really should do that. I'm like, and here's the best corner to hold that sign, because when I walk into that meeting, I want to be held accountable. I want my colleagues to see that folks are out there. I want to sit on that dais and say, people are watching us. We need to make the right decisions. That's the power of the people. And again, elected leaders, the best thing you can do is put us out of office if we're not doing what we should be.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
So I'm going to ask a question about compensation in education. We know that it's unsustainably low, especially in early childhood education. That's something that we've been talking a lot in our classes, really from the very beginning. It's the lived experiences of a lot of us. So I guess my question would be, what would you recommend folks do to address that issue?
That's a hard one. And I 100% agree. I think the compensation issue is one, especially with early learning. The one thing that I talk to folks about is value. And one of the problems, again, pre-pandemic and to a certain extent now, but especially before this pandemic, people didn't value early learning, right? They looked at it as just like daycare. Why can't you have the grandmother watch? Why there was, every there's a lot of folks older than me from maybe more conservative districts who always have a story about no, just take them down to so-and-so's house and that's all you need, right? And then you'll be fine. But we all know that there's value in early learning. We all know it's the best investment you can make in a child. It pays dividends beyond just that pre-K through kindergarten, but yet we don't value it. So part of it's a mindset change. We need to start valuing it and seeing it, much to our federal folks are making the point that it's infrastructure. And guess what? When we didn't have access to early learning and childcare, stuff stopped. Businesses stopped. People couldn't go to work. Oh, now there's value, right? Now all of a sudden it's like, oh, wait, we need this. Absolutely. So I think now we're at this intersection where we understand the value implicitly, the impact it makes on business, the impact it makes on communities when early learning opportunities are not there and when they're not up to par. So now we have to put our money where our values are. And that's what we tried to do this session in legislature with our Fair Start for Kids Act, and making additional spots and having more resources for childcare workers, having benefits available for childcare workers. But I will tell you, it is the first basic and baby step. We have so much more to go. We have to get to a point where, and I don't want to say that I'm advocating one thing or another, but if you think about our teachers, our certificated teachers, right? They are organized, they are together. You're not going to have a certificated teacher making something far less than their peer in a different building because they've got this organizational structure that won't allow for it. I think we need to do something similar with childcare workers and with early learning. And I'm not saying, oh, go out and unionize or go do this or do that, but there has to be a point where the value is seen. And as a consumer of it, and as you know, an end user, right? Those businesses that have employees that need childcare, everybody has to have skin in the game. So we need more pay, we need better benefits, we need consistency, but we need people to value it so that we can get there.
Thank you.
Sorry, my answers are so long. I like, you guys are hitting all my like favorite soapbox questions. So I'm kind of like, ah.
No, I love it. Don't apologize. They're complicated issues.
They are.
Maybe as a follow-up to that, a lot of our students are looking to find ways to advocate for compensation. What would you recommend, or how do you recommend they get involved in government to advocate for their compensation?
Yeah, I would say one of the best ways is testifying on bills. And we always have bills dealing with early learning, childcare expenses, and various things, and testifying with their lived experience. Because I think that is one problem with leadership at every level, is that we only know what we know. Right. So if I'm not talking to my local childcare providers, if I had been a person who had never experienced paying for childcare, right, that all of a sudden it's a real hard conversation. It's hard for me to contextualize why it's important or what needs to be done. But when you go and testify on the bill, the great thing is now you can testify remotely, which I think will be I don't think that's going anywhere, but it's also warehoused. And so the way we warehouse it is it's tvw.org. It's a website. It's also on your Comcast station. But what happens is when you go to a bill, and you can go through our legislative website, I'll actually send you a link, Samantha, because the cool thing is you can look up a bill and then you can click on the testimony and you can see it. So for me as a legislator, even if I'm not watching that committee and watching you testify, I can go back, and when that bill I'm going to vote on, I'm going to watch your testimony to see why you thought it was a good idea or why you thought it was a bad idea. And that gets warehoused forever. So even to, back to my menstruation bill, I was talking about this amazing Republican senator who just kind of like, did some straight talk with her colleagues on the floor of the Senate. I'm not in the Senate. I watched it on TVW and I shared the link because I'm like, ooh, she went there. But that's the powerfulness. That's how you can have your voice heard and don't feel like it's in this vacuum, because it really is saved and archived forever. And most times on the weekends, we'll see what bills are coming up. And as legislators, we'll just start clicking on the testimony to see what people were saying about it so that we can vote just being more informed in our vote. So I would say that's the piece for me. The other thing is writing emails. So again, because we've gone to this virtual world, those emails, the way you put them in the portal, you can actually do it on a specific bill. And then I can look up all of the emails pro and con on that bill. I can even see just how many were sent. So for instance, we did this little thing called capital gains. And when I was running that committee and doing the testifying, I could see that I think it was like over 1,000 people had written in Did I read all 1,000? No. Did I know people were passionate about that issue? Yes. And so it made a huge difference, right? It impacted me to say, wow, this is a big issue. People were definitely on both sides of it. But we look at all of that. So I would just say, keep having your voice heard and remembering that you have to have it heard on the House side and the Senate side because bills get testified on both sides.
Out of curiosity, this is my first time hearing like testifying on a bill. How would one actually do that? Do you have to write in
Mm.
and then someone chooses you to testify?
Yeah, well, sorta. It's kind of that's great. I'd love it when because I'm working on kind of like this web series of like how almost like Schoolhouse Rock for our state politics. Basically, so yes, so the way it is, you'll have a bill number. Let's say it's 1273, and you'll go into this portal, and you'll basically look at it and you'll say, oh, it's up for committee on Tuesday, and then you can click to either register to testify live, or you can click and do written testimony. And it doesn't even have to be written. You can actually click and just say pro or con. It could be that simple. Or you can send in an email, and that email will actually go out to everybody in the committee. That said, your point about so when you, depending on the committee, like, so when I was doing finance and kind of saying who was going to testify, people would sign up on panels. So let's say the four of you said, okay, we all want to testify together. I would say, yep, I'm going to call you all up as a panel, and then I can see if you're pro or con. So I would try and do a pro panel, a con panel, a pro panel, a con panel to make it super fair. And I tried to get through everybody who was on the list, but I also looked to see when you signed up. So if you signed up the first day that portal opened, I'm going to really try and get to you because that means you're really like, you want to talk. There are some people who sign up 5 minutes before the portal closes. I try, but if you've got 70 people signed up and you signed up 5 minutes before the portal closed, I don't know what to tell you. But that said, I always tell people be strategic. As soon as the portal opens, sign up. If you decide not to, just don't. I mean, if somebody if we call your name and you're not there, then we move on to the next person. So don't feel like, oh my gosh, this happened. I broke my leg, my car broke down, whatever. You just make sure you're just there.
Thank you.
Yeah, no problem. And I'll find that link for you because it's pretty cool the way our state makes it very, very transparent in terms of knowing what bills are out there and being able to testify on bills. So I will drop this in the chat because in the legislature, they don't give us a chat feature. That's another secret. So if I set up a Zoom meeting with anyone, I don't have a chat feature. Okay, so this is the website. You can go there, type in any bill number. It's by the year, right? So make sure you're typing in like you have the right year selected. And then you can kind of see the history of it. And honestly, you can see bills that didn't make it very far, and you can see bills that went all the way up to the governor's office. But also on that site, if you look at kind of the left-hand side of it, you can look at things like the House of Representatives, and you can look up by the person that represents you and see every bill they've prime sponsored, every bill they've co-sponsored. And then from there, click on the bill and see what happened to it.
I would have a question. So, like, you spoke about like teacher diversity earlier and like the importance of it and everything. What is some of the pushback or arguments against that not being something that needs to be spoke about or funded? What are some of the pushback? And then being Black, that's a whole nother subject. So, can you just
That's
speak a little
huge.
bit about that?
Yeah, so teacher diversity, there's a couple of things there. So I will say, I've only been doing this maybe 15 or so years. Everybody wants teacher diversity. That's always been this mantra. We need more diverse teachers. We need to see more teachers that look like our students. And if you notice, a lot of our districts are now majority world culture. So I hate saying minority, but the world culture is a global majority, and that's what our schools are starting to look like. And so the question becomes, if you've got 55 or 60% students of color, why do you only have 4% teachers of color? So I don't think there's a lack of will. It's not that people don't want it, but the one thing I hear is, oh, well, there aren't enough teachers of color applying for the jobs. Sometimes that's true. Sometimes I still ask more questions because first off, what are the barriers to our teachers of color in our teaching colleges, going through certification, getting the credentials they need, right? So what are those barriers? Second question, where are you recruiting from? If you have a district that's over 15,000 students and you're not actively recruiting from HBCUs, you've got a problem, right? So HBCUs, especially again, everything's virtual, is a great resource for teachers coming into diverse settings. When I say diverse, geographically diverse settings. And so that's the next piece. The next piece is a really important question that I think all districts need to ask themselves. How many teachers of color are applying? What a lot of districts like to do is tell you how many they hired, and they say, oh, well, we hired 1%, 2%, that's all we had to hire. Okay, well, how many applied? Because there could potentially be a bottleneck at that part of the funnel. And so that number is really important. The other number that's important is on the other side of it, your retention number. And I have seen this to the district where you will say, oh, every year we recruit 5% teachers of color, and every year you lose 20%. And I'm like, wait, what? And so that goes back to, well, that retention piece. So if we could retain in district the teachers of color that are being recruited and hired, and making sure, again, there's no bottleneck at that funnel of getting those teachers past that hiring point, if you can retain those teachers, we would be in a much different situation. Maybe not that much better, but you would at least be in double digits, like 10 or 11%, and not 3 and 4% teachers of color. A lot of issues with retention goes back to how your students of color feel in that classroom, right? So you ask yourself, like, oh my gosh, my students of color, they don't feel comfortable, they don't feel like they belong, they have these different issues. Well, guess what? Those same grown-ups have those same issues. And I will tell you, as a grown Black woman, if I have an issue in the workplace that I don't feel is getting solved, I'm choosing another workplace. Now, your students of color don't have that option. So they stay and they get timed out because there's a 12-year time clock that starts ticking. And most districts know that. So that's fine. Those students are going to come and so on and so forth. But those teachers have options. And so those teachers tend to leave. And so those retention numbers are very, very important about why aren't teachers staying, and what are districts doing when they find out why they aren't staying. And for some of the large, so this is my second school board, both of them, I always encourage affinity groups, having groups where teachers of color can come in and find affinity, commonality with other groups who look like them or have similar lived experiences, goes a long way towards retention.
Thank you so much.
Mhm.
Can I follow that up with another question? I mean, y'all gonna be silent. I'm
Sure.
gonna use the
Yeah.
time as I can, you know. Uh, no, I was wondering about. I'm really glad you said about the whole bringing, looking at HBCUs and working with certain districts that are thinking about crafting those initiatives. And sometimes it kind of fears me though, right? Of we want to be intentional on going to these different colleges and that are Black, but then we're not really prepared for them when they get here, right? So it's like we want to draw you all here. We're going to give you this
Yes.
stipend to live here, but
Yep.
you already have a problematic school system in place and you're
Yep.
not addressing the needs of those. So I think sometimes when I think about that, right, of like, yeah, let's go there. I'm like, what work is going to be done before they get here,
Get here.
right? Like,
Yep.
because we never speak about the generational trauma that's been, put on these students and these people of color who don't want to go back to these places to teach. So I was
Mhm.
wondering, I think that always goes back to that accountability piece of when like the state is providing a district all these
Mhm.
funds for teacher diversity, but then is not really held accountable. And I think that goes back to like your thing. You can't look at everything that's going on, right? So it's
Mhm.
like I always wonder, is there like a department like or possibility for like a 5-room place that will like hold these counties up like accountable for
Yeah.
saying, hey, you're messing up and we gave you $3
We
million
gave you this money. Yep.
you're still screwing up. So I was wondering, is it a hard hold on that or it takes another
So no, but from your mouth to God's ears, right? So what we have done is a Department of Equity. So we just this year we have a statewide office of equity to do just some of the things like you're talking about. And we have a director sort of have funding. The department was created last year because of COVID. The funding got canceled, but now we do have a little bit of the funding. We hired a director, and she is literally setting up shop. So that would be that place where that department's going to do a couple things. One, look at all of our policy through an equity lens, which we try to do right now, but of course we're not experts, so we need again that policy piece. But then two, to your point, holding folks accountable. So a great example would be 2 years ago, so not the session I was in, but the session before, we passed a bill that basically said all districts need to have a policy on school-based threat assessment. So when you have a threat, right, you need to have a way to assess it, and you work with your educational service district, you work with your district, you have different levels, all this stuff. One of the things we didn't put in there that I'm finding is the people doing these assessments, what's their training? Right. So it's like, oh, yeah, they should probably have some training, right? It shouldn't just be, folks who think they know. So that's a piece where we might have to go back and tweak it and make a change. But because we have this Department of Equity, instead of me saying I'm Rep Berg, I think we need to go change X, Y, and Z. Let's put this through an equity lens, right? Let's see what needs to be done, because maybe it's not just districts in my 44th having this issue. Maybe it's a statewide issue. Maybe there's statewide parameters. Because again, yeah, I can't look at all the districts, but they could actually say, here's a task force, here's a staff, here's this many person hours to look at that. So, so we're getting there. We're not there yet. And I keep telling folks, I had one county call me and say, oh, we need this, this, and this. I'm like, we're going to get there, but they don't have the money yet to do it. But to your point, to your first point though, about having folks come and us not being ready for them, that is huge. And so I tell districts all the time, honesty goes a long way. So do not go recruit at HBCUs and act like it's going to be the same cultural experience here as they have where they are, right? For any community, it could be Latinx, it could be African American, it could be Asian. You need to really tell people what the community is like where they're going. And that means the good, the bad, and the ugly, right? So if you've had issues, if for example, in the district that I serve, we do have a lot of Proud Boys. We have a lot of racial incidents. We have a colleague of mine, not very far from where I live, has called openly for civil war, right? And this is a sitting member of the legislature who carries a firearm on the floor. I mean, so and I will tell you right now, there are people of the school district that person represents is 24% students of color. Now tell me how that works. But again, being honest about it so that folks know what they're getting into. The flip side, is that we do have a strong community, and I can only speak for what I know of. I've only been here 24 years. I'm from the South Side of Chicago. It was a culture shock, but we have the Divine Nine here. We have all 9 historically Black Greek fraternities and sororities. We have a lot of organizations, Black organizations that have been around since the 20s and 30s that have very strong chapters here. So I try and get folks really connected into organizations, affiliations that either mean something to them or can help them do things as simple as finding a hairdresser, because it's those little things that help when, the bigger things you can't really control, but you can help people feel okay and involved and belong where they are.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, no problem. These are great questions. So
I have a question that's on a little bit more of a personal level. If you could tell us how you got involved. I know you talked about it a little bit at the beginning with your own children's experience in the school district, but how did you get to where you are?
yeah, that's a great question. And some of it was, just going back a little ways, even before that, was being from the South Side of Chicago and growing up in a somewhat homogeneous area where I grew up around Black doctors and dentists, veterinarians. Like it just nothing about that was like ooh wee and wow. And so it was a very strong cultural foundation. But I also grew up within, a stone's throw of the University of Chicago. So it was a very mixed community overall. So I went from that environment to Oregon State University in Corvallis to do college. And I was like, wait, what? And there were so many assumptions. And the biggest assumption looking at me having locks in the 90s was, what sport do you play? So what I figured out was I was at a university with it was very small back then, 15,000 students, 200 were Black, and about 50 of us weren't on a D1 scholarship. So that was a culture shock beyond culture shocks. But what I did was I got involved. And so I ended up running for student body president. I ended up being the youngest student body president ever elected, the first Black student body president. And like the fourth or fifth woman, right? Like most of the women before me had been elected during a war. And so there's that. So it was, and I didn't mean to make history, but what I meant to make was change. And so it showed me that if I set my mind to something, if I didn't worry about what other people were saying, that I could just go forth and do. So from that experience, I did a couple other things in politics in Oregon, came up here and, had kids and thought, well, isn't this lovely? Like I'll, just be that suburban mom. Well, lo and behold, again, assumptions, challenges, difficulties that I'm not sure I would have had in Chicago, just because those assumptions and challenges were very much based on race. So I ended up getting involved. And the most involvement I had was in elementary. My son's elementary school was running their chess club, and running a successful chess club. It turned out to be a big chess club. And then sitting on the state board of for the elementary state chess championship and being able to travel around the state doing that. But again, being somebody in a space that didn't look like she should be in that space. And so that that kind of just built on itself. Eventually I was on the school board in Edmonds, moved out here. When I say out here, Mill Creek, which is all of 20 minutes away. So still in Snohomish County, and no intention of running for office for anything. And then I was told, again, just, the only way to put it is when folks in education just talk to you sideways and you go, wait, what? And so that happened again with my daughter. And I said, yeah, so we're going to have to fix that. So I ran for school board and won that race. And, frankly, the seat became open in the legislature. There was a couple of things, especially around education policy, that school board directors just don't control. There's local control, but there's also, we are governed by the RCWs, by state laws. And there's a lot of them that just aren't working for kids of color, for kids like my kids, quite frankly, for what the suburbs is looking like and becoming, it's just not working. And so for me to make the changes I wanted to make, I had to run for a state office. In the meantime, you throw in a pandemic, you throw in a couple other challenges. I ended up keeping the school board seat because I think there's still more change I need to do locally on that board. But from a state perspective, I thought, let me keep doing what I can for kiddos and really for kids across the state in this way. And I would say, part of that advocacy, right? I wrote a lunch copay bill because it's just ridiculous that we are feeding every child during this pandemic, no questions asked. Every kid eats for free, but we're going to reopen our schools and charge kids 40 cents because they're on reduced lunch. So that was one of the bills I was able to get passed, another moonshot, which is that there will be no more reduced lunch fees, no more 40-cent fees in our state for any child, period. And that's gonna outlast me, that's gonna outlast the pandemic. And that's the kind of change I wanted to make. And so that's why, I kept running.
Wow. Thank you.
Yeah.
So much. I think that's just really inspiring to hear, especially for a lot of our students who are kind of thinking about their next steps and have been really exploring the systems that they're working in and the idea of entering in those systems and being able to make change. Just hearing about how you did that and how that's possible is wonderful.
Anybody can do it.
I have one last question, but before I ask it, I'll see if anyone else on the call has another question in our last little bit of time here. So my final question, as we kind of start to think about next steps, as I mentioned, our students are graduating. This is their last quarter in the bachelor's program at North Seattle in early childhood, and a lot of folks are thinking about what is coming up. And I would just love if you would be willing to share to our students any words of advice or anything that you can tell them that you think would be important kind of entering this hopefully soon post-pandemic world, but just entering the I guess not entering because everyone's in the middle of it right now, but what advice would you have for the graduates?
I would say just resiliency. I mean, that's been kind of the word of the moment right now, but being resilient. I think the career path that you've chosen and the field that you're about to enter is the most exciting ever. And also the most important, because again, I know you've probably seen and studied the studies that say what early childhood education does for not only the kiddos you're serving and the families, but honestly for our society. So I think, following your true north, working in a space that where you feel valued and you feel respected and that you can make a difference, but also knowing that all of it is one step that's going to build on the next. And so that resiliency factor is going to be huge. I mean, I remember being a young mom and probably looking younger than I was, and always looking like, oh, you know, why does she speak up here? What could she possibly know? But just be hardened that you know everything you need to. You are where you're supposed to be, being resilient, and even doors that close or opportunities that seem like they're passing you by, that's always going to be the best next step for the next big thing. So just don't get discouraged, but just know that the value, you know, I see you. I will tell you, every one of my colleagues sees you as being one of the most valuable professions, valuable fields that we have. We have seen that if our kids aren't taken care of, if our kids aren't being taught, if our kids aren't being loved on for that 8 to 10 hours a day that you're going to be with them, we have nothing as a society. So I just want you to know that, because I think the worst thing in the world is getting discouraged when you are in such a powerful, needed field. So be resilient and keep pushing. And if something needs to be changed, know that you can change it.
What a wonderful, wonderful way to move on in this conversation. Thank you so much
Yeah, thank
for
you.
everything that you've shared with us today, for answering all of our questions and sharing your experiences and your advice for folks going forward. We're so grateful that you took the time to join us.
Well, thank you so much. And thank you for putting it together. And thank you for being a teacher. Like, I can't say that enough. You know, thank you both for just teaching this class and getting folks, you know, the knowledge they need. And it's been great to talk with you, and reach out anytime.
We absolutely will.
Thank you so much.
Awesome. Have a good rest of your day. Thanks.
Thanks, you too.
Bye.